Hello, all. Thank you again for coming out tonight to the virtual town hall with Peter MacKay and the firearms community. We're seeing the numbers climb dramatically here to be part of the conversation with Peter MacKay. I wanted to introduce some special guests that we have, special guest panelists that we have tonight. First of all, my colleague, Blaine Calkins. Most of you know Blaine and his advocacy in the hunting and firearms community in the House of Commons. Great questioner of Minister Bill Blair over the past couple of weeks, asking those tough questions that, frankly, the minister can't answer. That said, we have some other panelists too that are special guests and no strangers to the firearms community. Tracy Wilson with the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights. Many of you know Tracy, so hello, Tracy. And also, again, a friend to many of us, just like Tracy, Tony Bernardo from the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Again, a friend, solid supporter of the firearms community, has been there. I don't even want to count the years, Tony. It's been, it feels like 100 years you've been there backing lawful firearms ownership and doing the best to support the community. So that said, I just wanted to pass it over to Blaine just to give a few comments. Go ahead, Blaine.
Thanks, Bob. And I'm really glad that everybody is on the line tonight. I just want to say a special thanks to Tracy and Tony and for your advocacy with your groups. And thank you for being staunch supporters of me as a law-abiding firearms owner and all the law-abiding firearms owners across this country. And thank you as well for being available to me as a member of Parliament whenever I need to ask some questions and get the lay of the land. And I always appreciate the honest and frank discussions that you guys give me. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm glad so many people have tuned in. I'm really happy that we have my good friend, Bob's good friend, all of our good friend, Peter MacKay on the line. I've known Peter for a very long time. I was elected in 2006 to the House of Commons at the start of the tenure of Stephen Harper. And for 10 years as a law-abiding firearms owner, I never once felt threatened that somebody was going to come and take my property. I felt safer because gentlemen like Peter MacKay, as our justice minister, was tackling crime and going to the root of the problem and leaving us alone, knowing who the problem in this country is and who isn't the problem. And that's why I and guys like Bob are supporting Peter MacKay, because we know that he always comes down on the right side of these issues. So thank you so much for your leadership in the past, Peter, and I'm just glad that you're on this call tonight, and I wish you all the best as you continue forward to become the leader of the Conservative Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada to stop the train wreck that we have right now running this country.
So just before I pass it over, I'll just say a few words too, just about Peter and the reason why many in the gun community know us well and know our support for lawful firearms owners. It's one of the questions when Peter had called me to support him. It was about firearms owners and, supporting that particular community that are friends of ours. They're real people like you are on the call that just obey the law and just want to keep doing. You want to keep hunting and do what you've done for many, many years and have a government that's going to support you in that. So that was one of my questions, and Peter really answered it great. Support for lawful firearms owners. He's been supportive in the past. And, issues aside, I'd say the reason why, again, Peter's heard me say this many times, but it's really Peter's character is the main reason why I'm here supporting Peter. Here's a guy that we've known for many years. I've known him since 2011, really worked in the trenches for justice, worked hard for us as Canadians. We were in government as a minister of defense, minister of justice, and now continues to want to serve Canadians and really make Canada a better place. For his kids and ours. So again, I hope that you get to know a little bit of the real Peter MacKay that we know, the person on the call tonight. And so without any further delay, Peter MacKay.
Bob, thank you very much for the kind words, and to Blaine, both great friends and colleagues who I've had the pleasure of working with, and as was stated, very much not only speak up for lawful firearms owners in Canada, but are part of that community, represent it well, articulate the positions, speak up in a fearless and straightforward way, and make their points, as was alluded to in the House of Commons, but around the country. We've got people here from all parts of Canada joining us here tonight, over 1,000 on the line. I also want to acknowledge Tracy and Tony for being with us, representing their associations and joining us tonight, and people from all parts of Canada who are in the firearms community. And I feel very much a part of this community as well. I grew up in a rural community in Nova Scotia. And my earliest memories, quite frankly, of spending time with my grandfather involved walking in the woods where he would carry a rifle. And for my 12th birthday, I got a 410 shotgun. And I thought that was the greatest gift that I'd ever received, and I cherish it. I have another bird gun that my other grandfather, who was Irish, gave me, and it's more of an antique, and it breaks down, and it's a beautiful, beautiful old gun. But I'm not sure that I would even be able to register it today, given some of these archaic and new rules around the ban, and we're going to have a chance to talk about that tonight. So I appreciate so many people joining us tonight. I know that there has been a tremendous amount of consternation and discussion over the past number of weeks, and I would be remiss if right off the top, having said I grew up in a rural community in Nova Scotia, much of what we have seen was a political act of opportunism in the aftermath of the worst mass shooting in Canadian history in a community near where I grew up in Portapique, Nova Scotia. Of course, I think it bears referencing that this happened because of a madman and an individual who had no right to own firearms based on prior criminal acts and was using guns that I think any objective inquiry will determine were obtained illegally and were probably illegal by definition. And so this is what was so offensive, and it's why I came out within days of the announcement condemning the government for what they were doing. And obscure in all of this is the reality that what was proposed and what is found in Bill 71, in addition to the ban, would have no impact on the prevention of that crime or others that they're trying to link it to. And frankly, this is part of the failed playbook that we've seen time and time again from Liberals, demonizing law-abiding firearms owners. And Tony, it's great to have you on this call, because some of my earliest memories of working on issues related to lawful firearms ownership goes back to, of course, the charge that you and many others led to end Bill C-68, the long gun registry, the billion-dollar boondoggle that Alan Rock perpetrated on the country under the Chrétien government. And I can tell you, in no small part, I was elected first in 1997 because of the backlash against that bill. I remember there were more signs on people's lawns that had C-68 with an X through it than Peter MacKay signs throughout my constituency. I felt that I might be running against Tony Bernardo at various times in that campaign. But all of that to say that it is woven into the rural life. And I think of, you know, the rifles, the long guns that we had in our home, the same way that I thought of some of the farm implements that we had on the farm. They served a purpose. You obviously were taught from a very early age about safety and the importance of respect for firearms. But it's part of the culture that I'm afraid that Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Blair, even surprisingly, have absolutely no respect for. And yet, I think Canadians from communities large and small, when they see the details and when they're presented with the facts and the reality and the impact of what these efforts behind what the Liberals are doing to penalize law-abiding and responsible firearms owners, they are completely mortified and they're against what the Liberals are doing. So there's a very important education component that should never be lost in the discussion, and bringing it back to the facts. And the facts are that these efforts, which were done through an order in council, of course, which avoids parliamentary scrutiny and the normal process of making changes in the law, and of course, Bill 71 itself, which dovetails together with the ban, I will tell you off the top, both of those need to be undone. And that means a full repeal of Bill C-71, and it means undoing this ban in its entirety. So I want to be crystal clear off the top that is certainly the intention that I would have. Get rid of them both, and bring the discussion back to what we do about public safety, how we combat illegal firearms, how we shut down the trafficking at the border that is prolific, how we go after gangbangers, gangs, illegal motorcycle gangs, all of these groups that traffic in firearms that are illegal and are mostly handguns, if we're going to be frank about the discussion, and talk about the issues that matter, that smuggling, illegality, the criminal activity, and do away with some of the deliberately misleading and divisive discussion around military-style assault rifles. Well, I spent a good deal of my professional career working with police and working with soldiers. I know what a military assault rifle is. I've fired them before. My daughter's godfather is a retired staff sergeant, and I consider police some of my closest friends. They have real concerns about these farcical changes that the Liberals have introduced. And this has real life impact on people's businesses. It has impact on their lives in ways that are yet to be understood by a lot of Canadians. And as we all know, certainly everybody on this call, I suspect, knows, we already have very rigorous licensing and regulations around the use and the ownership and the transportation of firearms, including very intensive screening processes that go in the front end. And this is all to do with safety. And I know of no group that is more hardwired to the importance of safety than the culture of the lawful firearms community in Canada. This bill is punitive, it's random, it goes after completely the wrong people, and yet it is all done in almost a Hollywood-like production. And I don't make that reference lightly, but in real terms, a lot of what uninformed Canadians who are not familiar with firearms think is what they hear from American culture. And that includes the movie scene. And it conjures up all of the wrong images. Everyone here knows we don't have military assault rifles in Canada unless you're members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And those long arms, as you know, are strictly controlled. And yet, that type of language was meant to scare people, plain and simple. We haven't had those rifles available on the market since the late 1970s. And that again is lost in much of the discussion that we've seen in the last number of weeks. And so hunters and sport shooters and collectors is not the group that Canadians need to be protected from. Quite the opposite. They have a vested interest, of course, in complying with the law, respecting the law, upholding the law, and they simply want to be left to their own devices, frankly, which is of no harm to anyone. And in fact, is a completely legitimate part of Canada's history and culture. And it is painful, frankly, to see some of the misrepresentations coming out of the government of Canada today. I've always stood with the lawful Canadian firearms community from my earliest time in elected office in 1997 throughout my time. And I'm not going to recite my resume, but certainly during my time as Justice Minister and previously as part of Stephen Harper's government, we brought in real measures, tough sanctions, mandatory minimum penalties for the illegal use, transportation of firearms. We obviously upped the ante in terms of the penalties that would attach. And I have memories as a Crown Attorney in Nova Scotia doing the same and ensuring that those who used firearms for an illegal purpose, that's where the law needs to intervene and step in. So with all of that said, I'm proud to support the efforts I know that are underway, certainly led by Bob and Blaine, Tracy, and Tony, and many others, to repeal ineffective legislation, put in place the type of protections that the public really need and deserve, and replace in a way that will have an impact. The way that we did finally in 2011, I was proud to be part of the government that finally repealed that expensive and useless long gun registry. That's what makes Canadians safer, is having the focus where it should be in protecting them. And I will speak in some detail perhaps to questions that you might have, but just in broad terms, the RCMP are not the ones who should be classifying firearms. It should be our democratically elected members of parliament and members of the cabinet and government. We need to simplify the classification system itself, obviously, as per our own party's policy. This is a long-standing position that we held, that we would rewrite the Firearms Act, which I think is long overdue. And so having a simplified classification system is good for everyone. And that, again, would be part of a platform that I would introduce. And reestablishing the Canadian Firearms Experts Technical Committee. And this is, again, to ensure that we have evidence-based decisions being made when it comes to firearms, and ensuring that that group of experts is giving meaningful input to those decision makers in government, in the cabinet, and having members of various groups on that council, including stakeholder groups like those represented here tonight with us. And finally, I would also say we need to renew the Canadian Firearms Advocacy Committee, and I think education is a big part of it. I referenced it already. We need to have the public gain a greater understanding of both the law and the legitimacy of firearms in this country, and ensuring that we bring in that higher standard of knowledge and apply that in all areas of the law, so that Canadians can feel comfort and can feel a great deal of confidence in the decisions that affect them and affect the firearms community. So looking for solutions as opposed to creating problems or getting headlines, which is what the Liberals have been doing lately. So there's other things that we can do and we can talk about tonight, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'll turn it back over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Peter. We'll go next. I'll just make an announcement for everybody. It looks like everybody's well ahead of me on this. In the Q&A part of the call, that's where you can put forward questions that you want to pose to Peter directly. And the process will be, we'll have you come on. We probably can't get to everybody, unfortunately. There's over 100 there waiting in the queue, but put your question there and we will actually ask you to pose it to Peter directly in your own words with your own voice. But let's go to Tony Bernardo, who again is no stranger to this community. Go ahead, Tony. Welcome to the call tonight.
Well, thank you, Bob, and good evening, Peter. I started working with you, Peter, back in 1997 when you were a new MP and you came into the fury around C-68, and we spent a lot of time together dealing with issues for your constituents. And it's mystifying our community because I know you to be a very intelligent person on firearms issues. You do know your stuff. And back in 2000, you made a statement that you said in perfect gun legislation, assault rifles and automatic weapons would be banned. Now, given the current confusion and vigor that the Liberals have been pursuing a, quote, assault weapons ban, how do you balance the statement that you made back in 2000 with the situation that's happening 20 years later?
Well, Tony, that's a great question, and thank you for noting the history that you and I have enjoyed in previous battles to bring about fair and just legislation for lawful gun owners. Look, I'll respond directly to your question. I meant exactly, I mean precisely what I said in that article, and I know firearms owners review the details. So what I said precisely, you will note, I didn't say assault weapons, which is a fake term. That's something that's made up, you know, along with the military style. It has no meaning in law, but you know, it has to be clearly understood. I use the words assault rifles, and that, of course, as you referenced, it means fully automatic. It is select fire. It's the type of rifle that I referenced earlier that were banned back in the 70s, and you know, I've certainly fired C7s, the old FN, when I was in the Department of National Defense. I know what a fully automatic rifle is and what it does. And so I meant exactly what I said, that those guns are illegal, and those guns were and are banned in Canada. And so that's what I was referencing in that article. And of course, like a lot of things, they get clipped and they get taken out of context. When you read the whole article, it's very clear, it should be, that I have been a supportive and very vocal advocate in favor of lawful gun ownership in Canada throughout my entire 25-year career.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. We next have a question. It goes to Gabriel. I apologize. I'm not a great pronouncer of last names. My apologies. Gabriel Thériault. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. MacKay.
Bonjour, Gabriel. Ça va bien?
Oh, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. If you don't mind, I would like to practice my English tonight because you understand that I'm francophone, but sometimes it's good to practice your English. So
pas de problème. Peut-être je réponds en français si vous préférez.
no problem. We could do that. But for the other people, they will not like it, I think. So
where are you calling from, Gabriel?
From Victoriaville, Quebec.
Ah, Victoriaville. Excellent.
Yes. So rural community like you in kind of where you grew up back in the days in Nova Scotia. So that being said, if you are elected Prime Minister, what will be your plan in order to fight illegal arms smuggling? Because let's tell the truth, the problem is kind of related to Indian reserves, the border, but could you please just go beyond these simple notions, because I'm not saying you simplify it, but you know what I mean, I guess.
Oui, vous avez raison, Gabriel, et je réponds en anglais, mais j'apprécie beaucoup votre question parce que c'est tellement important. C'est nécessaire de concentrer dans les efforts illégaux, pas des personnes qui respectent le droit. You're right. Big part of the problem in Canada is at the border, and some of it is at First Nations Reserve, where there's a lot of contraband, not just weapons, not just guns, drugs, and even human trafficking happening in some border communities. And so, look, it means beefing up borders. It means having more security forces there, including police, but also our Canada Border Services Agency. And it means working more in close unison with American authorities, because they're equally interested in shutting down illegal trade at the border and capturing contraband. I would take immediately that $600 million that Mr. Trudeau has earmarked to buy back firearms, which I see as this. It's in the same vein as the original Bill C-68. It's completely wasteful and have no impact. And I would put that into frontline policing. So that as a start, and go after the illegal guns that are posing a threat to Canadians. I would take decisive action to combat organized crime. And again, that has to be done in a cross-border fashion. And it does include going into some of the rural communities that don't have the type of coverage that you would get in larger communities. It means actually focusing in a way and bringing the resources to bear on the real problem in the places that the guns are coming across the border. Tougher measures to deter, so more mandatory minimum penalties, and we brought in a lot of them. We brought in a truckload of mandatory minimum penalties, some of which were struck down by the courts, unfortunately. And putting in place provisions that allow for the seizure of weapons and property, including the transportation. So if they're bringing an 18-wheeler or a Volkswagen Rabbit across the border and it has illegal guns, you take it. The same way, quite frankly, there are provisions, of course, right now in Canada, that if you're hunting illegally, they can take your truck. We should absolutely be able to do the same when it comes to the importation of illegal firearms. Mm-hmm. So tougher measures, mandatory minimum penalties, more resources for policing is the starting point as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Gabriel. We'll go up next. It's something about our firearms community. There's thousands across this country, but we all get to know you as friends, and here's a familiar face. Liam O'Brien, the next question for Peter MacKay.
Hey, Liam. Thanks for calling in.
Hello, Peter. Oh, nice to see you. It's been a while. Just wanted to ask a question, or that it's something. Oh, hello?
Yep, okay. We're still there, Liam.
Okay, so law-abiding firearms owners know the frustration and the fear of facing a firearms license expiry, something we never had to face under the old FAC system. Mm-hmm. And that can lead to seizure of their private property, and also it can lead to possible criminal charges. And some folks, like Mr. Blair, have taken advantages in the past with many law-abiding firearms owners. Our host, Mr. MP Bob Zimmer, had a private member's bill, C-346, I believe, that would change that thing so that if your license does expire, I apologize, Bob, if I'm misdescribing this, but basically the idea is that you no longer face those consequences. You do face a suspension situation where you can't buy ammo or acquire, I think, but the idea is that it would, prevent the criminalization of law-abiding firearms owners. I mean, to put it simply, you know how when your license expires, someone doesn't come and take your car away or put you in jail. So I was wondering if you'd support this as a part of a Peter MacKay-led Conservative government, and keep up the good work on the other files.
Thank you very much, Liam, and great to hear your voice. Miss seeing you around. Liam, I would 100% support the decriminalization of something as innocuous as sometimes simply forgetting to fill in the paperwork or renew. And Bob's private members bill captures that perfectly. Now, I didn't have a hand in drafting it, and I would want to go through it line by line. I completely trust Bob, I got to tell you. Mm-hmm. But I also have spent enough time at the Department of Justice that I know you got to run it through the mill to make sure that we're going to avoid any constitutional challenges or any efforts to knock that legislation down. But the principle is absolutely right. And so, yes, I 100% believe that you decriminalize those type of paperwork offenses, and you still have certain sanctions available if it's supported by the evidence, but having it have criminal code sanctions attached is completely inappropriate and excessive.
Yeah. Thank you, Liam, for actually remembering that bill. It seems like it's been a long time before I've heard that mentioned. So, yeah, there's not much in Canada where we see just because a license has expired. The analogy, the comparison was the car that's sitting outside on your driveway. Once the license expires, you're not a criminal once that expiry occurs. So why should it happen with lawful firearms owners? So,
well, common sense goes a long way, Bob, and you'll know that in most provincial motor vehicles acts, there's even now provisions that allow you a certain grace period to prove that
right.
you intended to renew, and so there's elements of the legislation that really do come back to common sense. There's no nexus between public protection and somebody simply forgetting to renew or having something expire if they're not actively engaged.
Great.
No criminalization without criminal intent. That's a great way to sum it all up. And thanks, Liam, for reminding me that here in Alberta, it's my month to renew my registration for my vehicles, and I've got 10 days left to do so, so I'm going to go do that tomorrow. But now it's my pleasure to introduce a good friend to the firearms community, somebody who I've known for quite some time now and has always been helpful in my role as a member of Parliament, has played an advisory role to me, and I know a large number of MPs, and is just a great advocate and great with media, and very, very knowledgeable. So Tracy Wilson from the CCFR, welcome to the call.
Thanks, Blaine. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's here tonight. My name is Tracy Wilson, and I am the Vice President of Public Relations for the CCFR. And I'm also a registered lobbyist. So when they talk about the evil gun lobby, they're talking about a Chihuahua owning grandma from Ottawa here. Peter, I wanted to kind of jump right into this. Under a MacKay administration, would you implement the simplified classification system that was adopted as party policy if you are the leader and win a majority? And would you do it right away, or would it sort of become an election promise for next time?
No, that's something that you would want to act on right away. And look, I think more broadly, Tracy, as you know better than many, the simplification is only part of the revisions that have to occur within the Firearms Act. But the simplification system is, as you mentioned, it's part of party policy, and it will be again at our next party convention, which has been pushed because of COVID-19. But that's something that our members, certainly Bob, Blaine, and other members of the caucus, feel very strongly about. I know Larry Miller, who's a great friend and is supporting me, has long championed that need to simplify the process and to rewrite the Firearms Act to reflect that. And so I spoke earlier about the necessity of having a classification that's based on actual function as opposed to the appearance. You know, my son's got a couple of Nerf guns that might be banned now under Minister Blair's legislation. Look, you know, something that's black and plastic and scary should not be, you know, that doesn't enter into the actual calculus of what should be deemed as a weapon that's going to somehow pose a criminal intent. And so we need to address the language, put it in plain language that people understand. That also increases compliance. It increases people's ability to understand the actual language found in the act. And that, I think, brings us to a better place in terms of public safety.
I agree.
Okay, thank you so much, Tracy, and thanks, Peter. I guess next we got Brandon Vignando up there. Brandon, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Thank you for taking my question, Peter.
Hi, Brandon.
When I hear a lot of chatter on the internet, people sometimes don't like one candidate or another. One thing I hear a lot is, they say Peter is a red Tory, and my question is really around what's your thought on that, and how would you unite people across the conservative spectrum and even, potentially into the sort of the liberal and NDP camps?
Well, Brendan, that's a great question, and it's one that I've thought a lot about, and I've actually been involved in unifications of conservatives before, as you may recall. I shook hands with Stephen Harper back around 2002, 2003, and we worked to unite a fractured conservative movement in Canada. So that was kind of part of my life's work when I was a member of Parliament and formerly leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. And lo and behold, it allowed us to return a short time later and have 10 years in government, 3 successive elections, including a majority conservative government, that allowed us to go about doing good things for Canadians broadly. Certainly the gun community will recall that we spoke about it earlier, got rid of finally that long gun registry and put in place sensible, and getting the big thumbs up there from Blaine. We were able to put the emphasis back on protecting Canadians and not to mention protecting Canadians' pocketbooks and backyards as far as our economy is concerned. So there's a lot more that unites conservatives than how they see themselves on the spectrum. And I don't accept these labels that get placed upon me because I grew up in Atlantic Canada. People try to paint this particular picture of me. Look at the portfolios that I held. Look at the positions I've been pronounced on tonight. I was Minister of Defense that tried to really refurbish and rebuild our national armed forces. I brought in tough criminal legislation. As a Minister of Foreign Affairs, I took principled stands on the global stage when it came to advancing Canada's interests, but standing strong with our allies, taking positions that were meant to not just go along to get along. We didn't have muddled positions. We were part of a very principled, focused conservative government. And so I'm a Canadian conservative. I'm a principled, pragmatic conservative, and I have made the decision to return to public office after having worked as a criminal justice lawyer. And I served in Parliament for 18 years, ran 6 times, and was elected in my rural constituency back in Nova Scotia. I left in large part because I felt it was time to take a break. And I have small children. And we've had 2 children since I left politics. And in large part, it is when I think about how the country has been mishandled and mismanaged under this government, that I want to improve this country for my children and for everybody's children, because we are headed into a perilous place with massive deficits and debt. And we have bungled so many files on the global stage. Our allies are not sure that they can depend on us. We've again punted some of the big decisions around improving the Canadian Armed Forces. We're neglecting our veterans. We're seeing the same sort of mismanagement that we experienced for almost 14 years under the Chrétien-Martin governments. And had we not unified conservatives, and this is the last point I'll make, I want to come back to your question, but had we not unified and stayed unified as a conservative movement, we wouldn't have been able to defeat that government, even in the aftermath of the Gomery inquiry, which is seldom mentioned anymore, a massive corruption that was perpetrated on the country. And if we don't stay unified, if we don't deal with things like Western discontent and alienation that's felt in Atlantic Canada and elsewhere, we've got to unify our party if we are going to be able to unify the country and address the big challenges post-COVID-19.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go to Tristan next, but first of all, we have a poll question that we want to ask you to participate in. It's, will you be supporting Peter MacKay to be the next leader of the Conservative Party of Canada? And you can select yes, no, or undecided in that those 3 options. So Now we'll go to Tristan. Go ahead, Tristan Coombes. Peter, question for Peter. Go ahead.
Hey, Tristan.
Tristan, it says that you need to unmute yourself. So just
There he goes. Yeah, he's good.
Good.
Oh, are we good?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, thanks. A lot of the other main leadership candidates that I've seen talk about it are talking about larger firearms reforms. What, Peter, is your plan for the Firearms Act as a whole in Canada?
Yeah, Tristan, that's a great question. And the short answer is I think we need a rewrite. Sometimes, and I've heard others mention a complete repeal of the Firearms Act. And, I've had a hand in drafting a lot of legislation over the years. And it kind of reminds me of shingles on a roof. And sometimes you need to strip that roof right down to the studs and replace it entirely. The trouble with firearms legislation is there is still a real connotation, and Tracy Wilson knows a lot about the public relations efforts to educate the public. I don't want to be backed into a corner by the liberal media and liberals and NDP and even Bloc who say, look at the Conservatives, they're completely repealing, they're removing firearms legislation that is meant to protect Canadians. We don't need to fight that battle. I think, quite frankly, a comprehensive rewrite of firearms legislation that deals with many of the issues that we've talked about here in terms of the simplification, changing some of the elements that lead to criminality for paper offenses, and ensuring that we get it right and it's informed by the firearms community, by all police forces, not just the RCMP, and that it's properly debated. Unlike the OIC efforts that the Liberals have brought about, that we bring about an actual education effort to lessen some of the pressures and misconceptions that exist in Canada about firearms. I think it could be done in a very straightforward and well-articulated debate in a way that would elevate Canadians' comfort level and understanding when it came to the lawful use of firearms.
Thank you very much for that question. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter, for that, and Tristan for that question. To Blaine Calkins, who's going to make a special introduction of a colleague.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Hey, it's great. I got a little message here while we were on the call, Peter, and our good friend Pierre Paul-Hus, who is an MP and the official critic for public safety for the Conservative Party and the official opposition, is on the line. And Pierre, welcome to the call.
Oh, thank you, Blaine. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Peter, to be here with us tonight. But yes, I'm not used to be with the English-speaking guys, but I hope my English is good enough for you guys. And I know
excellent,
that
Pierre. C'est absolument, c'est exceptionnel et c'est meilleur que mon français. Et Pierre, félicitations pour la question que vous posez aujourd'hui, Minister Blair. Pierre Paul-Hus gave a great question to Minister Blair. And once again, it looked like the minister was chasing his tail. He didn't know whether to wind his watch or steal second.
Yes, and if people on the call want to see it, Tracy Wilson just put my question on CCFR Facebook page, so can go to see it, translate. So it's crazy to see how Bill Blair it's very crazy because Bill is a former chief police officer, Toronto chief police, and I actually just follow what Justin Trudeau asked, and it's bad for him. So thanks, Peter, and thank you, Bob and Blaine for the meeting.
It's great to have you with us, Pierre, and thank you for all your good work and all of your service. You're a man all about service, your time in the Canadian Armed Forces, and now, of course, being a very effective member of our caucus and somebody who is always courageously speaking up for causes you believe in. And in this instance, of course, it's lawful firearms owners in Canada. So great to have you with us, Pierre.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks.
Yeah, and one of many of our Quebec colleagues that are conservatives. There's many conservatives in Quebec. I live in British Columbia, and I think a lot of us out west don't understand that. So anyway, thanks for coming on, Pierre. We'll go to another question from our old friend, Tony Bernardo. Tony, are you ready to go with the next question?
Maybe just while Tony's coming on the line.
There we go.
Pierre, and you mentioned it as well, Bob. Pierre and I were talking to a guy earlier today who referenced the the sales of firearms in Canada and the huge economic impact. There's over 2 million, well over 2 million legal firearms owners in Canada. And there is an enormous economic impact brought about by Bill C-71 and this firearms ban. It has impacted thousands of jobs, or will impact further in terms of hunting, sport shooting, ranges, but also the owners and the proprietors. And we spoke to this guy in Quebec who was telling us that there's a place, Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, where they have $3 million in inventory that's sitting there being held up as a result of these recent changes. And so this sometimes gets lost in the discussion, is the actual impact in a time like COVID-19, where so many businesses are hanging on by their fingernails and trying to keep their head above water. And this is going to further hammer those legitimate businesses and guides and those who hunt and those who are part of that broader tourism community in rural communities in Quebec, but around the country. And it's just piling on. It's a bit like the carbon tax. It's just a kick in the guts while people are down and already having a hard time.
Thank you once again, Peter. We'll go to Tony. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bob. Peter, you remember back when the Firearms Act was introduced, and we all warned about the dangers of order in council and how that one day they would use it against us. And the day has come now, and we're seeing the tragic results of this massive use of order in council to circumvent Parliament. If you were to form a government, how would you ensure that lawful firearms owners will not have to ever deal with this order in council nonsense again?
Well, that's easier said than done. To rewrite order in council provisions to prevent any future government from using order in council is a tall order. You're talking in some cases about even the type of constitutional type amendments that require massive parliamentary reform, involvement, consultation. And so to that end, what I would propose is that changes to the Firearms Act, while we talked a little bit earlier about what some of those changes could and should be, I don't think that there is a short and easy answer to prevent future governments. There's something in law called the rule against perpetuity. And that is to say that you can't tie the hands of future governments to prevent them from doing certain things. You can change legislation and make detailed changes, as we have in the past. And then, of course, there's always the ever-present interventions that come from the courts. Yeah. And Tony, you and I both know, and we've all, I suspect many on this call have seen firsthand how the courts can sometimes intervene in a very pernicious and unhelpful way. So what my experience tells me is that you try to write the law as airtight as possible. And then I think there's also a big component of public education that gets people on side and puts political pressure on future governments to not try this type of power grab that we've seen. This misuse of the order in council by the current government is another example of the bald-faced hypocrisy that Justin Trudeau and his gang in Ottawa represent. They used to criticize us for bringing in omnibus legislation, which is sometimes done basically for efficiency purposes, and you're bringing various bills together. Well, they've brought in more omnibus legislation in 4 years than we did in 10. And the list goes on of some of what they said and what they were only going to run $10 billion deficits, and they were going to, of course, change the electoral laws, and all of that, melted like the spring snow after they got in. I mean, the one thing they did do, of course, was ensure that we have more dope available to people in Canada, which has been going to do wonders for our productivity, I'm sure.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. If I may, up next, and thanks, Tony, for that question. And I believe if it's the Ann Jordan that I know, it's a question from someone up here in Alberta with me. And Ann, the floor is yours. Go right ahead. Unmute your device, Ann, and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I just have to remind myself what I did ask. Is it in the chat that I can find? Just a moment. I'm going to be really brief because you've got a series of gunnies on here. I want to thank you, Bob, Blaine, and the leaders from the firearm orgs. It's good to see all of you working together. And thanks, Peter, for your time. I would like to know an opinion on the greater provincial jurisdiction, some of the provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, talking about having their own CFOs and some of that more regional oversight, and also to hear your ideas on, you've mentioned already some of this, but checks and balances over, I know RCMP has that purview, but what checks and balances would you propose so those places of power are not abused in the future when you're in office? And that would be it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Look, I think in some ways, what has been proposed from certain provinces, I know Premier Kenney and some of the other Western provinces, but also out east, I was talking to Blaine Higgs today, the Premier of New Brunswick. There needs to be greater consideration of some of the regional needs, and that discussion I'm very open to, and I'm grateful for the fact that in Canada right now we are seeing a trend, at least provincially, to having more sensible conservative governments from east to west. And I think that bodes well for coming up with common sense solutions. And around the oversight, of course, Alberta, and Blaine is certainly aware, there's even discussion of bringing in a province-wide police force to replace our CMP, as they have in Ontario and Quebec, La Sûreté, the OPP. So look, there has to, and as everyone on this call would agree, there has to be a police contribution and involvement in both the drafting of a new Firearms Act and the enforcement side. And it makes sense to have that type of discussion at the front end to get it right. On the use of OIC, we just talked about with Tony, and tying future government's hands. Look, what I can say is that we would lead a government that was principally there to put the focus, the resources, and the law on the real offenders, which is not the lawful, law-respecting gun community in Canada. It's putting the emphasis on protecting the public. It's ensuring that the police are properly resourced and having the laws changed and amended in a way that makes sense for the betterment of our country. And so, I have a long track record that I'm proud of when it comes to standing up for lawful gun owners and searching for solutions. And I would certainly continue in that vein. And that is the approach that I would take. It's always going to be subject to parliamentary review. I'm a big believer in the democratic principle of presenting legislation to Parliament. Having parliamentary committees do their important work. Bob and Blaine can speak to that clearly. Then you hear from experts. You make the changes to the law so you don't get this slap dab, incoherent legislation that we have before us now. That, they were banning videos. They had elements of that legislation that detailed examination would have improved upon it, prevented. I think the legislation C-71 needs to be completely repealed. It's beyond any ability to fix it. But it's quite frankly embarrassing when one examines the detail of that legislation and how sloppy. I suspect that Bill Blair hasn't read it himself. And if he did, and if he hearkened back to his time as a police officer, surely he would have seen some of the failings of the bill. But maybe not. He's also, he's swallowed himself whole on the marijuana issue that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you for that question, Ann. And we'll go next to Rick Filsinger. Go ahead, Rick, for Peter MacKay.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate that. Peter?
Hey, Rick.
I'm first of all, my condolence to everything that has gone on in Nova Scotia these days. That is one hard-hit province. I'm so sorry to see all that going on.
Yeah, it's been a tough couple of weeks, including the recent downing of that Snowbird aircraft and
I know
Captain Jen Casey. It was another terrible blow to everyone, but certainly Nova Scotia is feeling the loss.
Yeah, she was a terrific public relations officer. Did a lot for the Snowbirds, and this whole inspiration mission has actually been a great idea. One of the few things that this government has done well. So getting to the topic, we go through this. Frankly, I'm tired and I'm frustrated. And we go through this nonsense of threatening law-abiding citizens, taking their property, or in some way suspending their use of this property over and over and over again. And I would like to know that I would like to know what you, as the leader of the Conservative Party, would propose and as Prime Minister do in order to prevent this from happening again. I know this is a complicated question. I know there's criminal code, firearms code, the whole 9 yards. But frankly, I've had enough of this nonsense. Let's get this straightened out. Let's put it in a place where we don't have to keep going through this. We waste money, we waste time. There's other things like feeding the people that are hungry in this country that we could do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rick. And what's the common denominator for every time we go through this episode? Every time we once again revisit lawful gun owners' rights, and you said it, it's property rights. It's people's rights to freedom, to enjoying being close to nature, to being out with family and friends and participating in a completely legitimate exercise, something I enjoyed as a young man growing up in Nova Scotia. And it's what all of my friends did. And it was what created some of the best memories that I have, quite frankly, of interacting with my dad and my grandfather. And so, I think I'm going to answer it this way. It's partly an education responsibility for government. And that includes all levels of government, because there's been some terrible misrepresentations that have happened at provincial and municipal levels as well on these important subjects. It's partly the rewrite that we talked about earlier in some detail on the Firearms Act itself. It's partly trying to ensconce these important provisions in the criminal code that put the focus where it has to be. It shifts away from the discussion of the legitimate, lawful gun owners in Canada and puts everything in terms of sanction, in terms of law, in terms of confiscation, in terms of police and resources on the criminal element, first and foremost. And so that direction has to come from the top. It has to be decisive. It has to be clearly enunciated. And some of it is messaging, that is subtle in nature. And yet sometimes it just has to be stated clearly. When there were activists in our country blockading our national railway, one would have expected that it wouldn't take 3 weeks. Well, first, the Prime Minister had to come back to Canada to deal with it, but it wouldn't take 3 weeks for the Prime Minister to clearly signal to law enforcement in this country, that Canada will not tolerate the blocking of our national railways. That is a pretty low bar. And so I can only tell you what a Conservative government would do. We would make the necessary adjustments and changes to the firearms legislation. We would repeal 71. We would do away with the ban. We would take part in legitimate efforts to educate the public on the importance of public safety versus the lawfully protected rights of gun owners in Canada, and shift the focus back to where it should be in discussing how we make Canadians truly safe. And sometimes, and I've always believed this as a Conservative, sometimes the best thing that a government can do is leave people alone. Get out of their way. Don't interfere with their lives. Don't make decisions for them that they should make for themselves. And that goes for the businesses too, stripping away red tape and regulations and burdens, things that are preventing the building of pipelines in this country, things that are holding back our ability, frankly, post-COVID-19 to get our economy off its back and get people back to work. The government talked about Canada's back. Well, we're at the back of the line. We're getting the back of the hand from China, and we're way back of the pack on a whole bunch of things that are going to make Canadians' lives better.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's a great answer, and thanks, Rick, for that question. It's one that's near and dear to all of our hearts because we're just tired of being the punching bag wrongfully based on a premise of lies from the other side. So great discussion. I'd like to bring it back now to our friend Tracy Wilson. Tracy, do you have another question for Peter?
I sure do, Blaine. Thanks a lot. So this is kind of a problem I see come up all the time. I am constantly getting calls from members who run into issues like renewing their PAL or their RPAL, and it's denied for one reason or another. And of course, they oppose the decision, but there is no recourse for a gun owner to, I'm a military mom, a military wife, and a military daughter. So I don't want to use the word ombudsman, but there's nobody for gun owners to go to sort of challenge these problems, unless, of course, they're willing to fund a court fight. And I'm just wondering what your opinion is on maybe putting some sort of recourse in place, an independent body, somebody to look at these issues and work things out so they're fair for everyone. I know Andrew Scheer had something like that in his firearms platform. He did call it an ombudsman and got beat up for it, but maybe we could look at something around that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Tracy, I'd love to talk about that with you further and to hear from, your membership, yourself and others. And I'm completely open to that. I think that the Firearms Advisory Committee could participate in some sort of an appeals process, or, I'm a big believer in due process. As somebody who practiced law, who spent a lot of time in a courtroom, people should have a chance to, air their grievances and ask the question, why? Why am I being denied this particular license? Why am I not permitted to pursue a life that I have enjoyed for years? And sometimes it comes across as very arbitrary, as you referenced. And so the rule of law should allow for some legitimate form of an airing of the evidence and hearing from the individual who's most affected. So I'm completely open to that idea of an appeals process that's built in. It might be a good addition to the Firearms Act when we go through the rewrite.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Co-hosting here, we're kind of stepping on each other's toes. I'm not a great dancer for that same reason. Ask my wife. Just say in closing, we're going to pass it over to my friend and colleague Blaine Calkins in a 30-second or less spiel for me. I just wanted to say I hope you got to know the person, Peter MacKay, that we all know very well. The reason why we think he's going to be a great leader for our country, and not just of the Conservative Party, but of our country. I think our country's in a place, again, this Firearms Town Hall, we don't need to say where it's at. The situation is dire if we don't change direction. And again, this is why I support Peter and many others. He's the leader we need in our country. He's got the character. He's got the backbone to take on a prime minister in an election on these special issues that are near and dear to our hearts. So that said, I just wanted to thank the guest panelists, Tony Bernardo, Tracy, and again, our leader, Peter MacKay. I'll pass it over to Blaine Calkins. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bob, and really appreciate everything that you've done as a caucus colleague over the years. We've had some pretty good battles, and we stood shoulder to shoulder on these issues. And it's always a pleasure to get a phone call from Bob saying, let's go to battle on this issue, and vice versa. So always appreciate that. You're doing a great job, and you're a great colleague, great MP. Thank you, PPH, Pierre Paul-Hus, for being on the call as well. He's always listening and always helpful whenever we have these issues, and making sure that all public safety issues, including firearms legislation, is front and center in front of the Conservative caucus whenever we have to fight back against this absolutely just atrocious policies that the Liberals have, and the vilification of law-abiding firearms owners such as myself. Tracy and Tony, again, I couldn't say, I can't say enough to just how much of a great resource you are to me as a member of Parliament, but moreover, how much you are, when I pick up the phone and call you and ask you questions, I trust you. I trust the information that you're going to give me, and that trust is so valuable, and that's why your organizations are so successful and doing such a great job. And last but not least, I just want to thank you, Peter. Thank you for coming on the call tonight and talking to everybody that signed up and came in on the call, and thank you for showing this interest. We've had well over 700 people participate on this call. I know there's a lot of questions there that we're not going to be able to get to, but you know what? Find another avenue to get that question to either myself or Bob. We'll see if we can get an answer to you and follow up with you. I just want you to know who I am, and why I'm supporting Peter MacKay. So I'm an Alberta farm boy. I grew up raising beef, worked in the oil patch when I was in the wintertime. I was a roughneck on a service rig when I wasn't. Working as a conservation officer in the summer. I've had a firearm in my hand since Dad and Grandpa trusted me to go out and shoot gophers, and that elevated all the way up to being a hunter. And I go to church on Sunday, and I'm supporting Peter MacKay. And if that's not good enough, I don't know what else is. I trust Peter. When I have an issue on behalf of my constituents, I remember, and I'll just say this quickly, one of the very first things that I had come across my plate when I was a member of Parliament in 2006, and Peter was the newly minted Foreign Affairs Minister. I had a constituent call me. Her son was on his deathbed in another country. It was the Friday, I think. The offices were closed. I think I was in the Calgary airport parking lot. I got a hold of Peter and said, this lady needs an emergency passport because she needs to get overseas to see her son, who might not last the weekend. 15 minutes later, Peter MacKay was on the phone solving that problem for me because he cares about people. And that's our job, is to care about people for the right issues. And that's why I'm supporting Peter. And Peter, why don't you just wrap up and bring us home, and just thank you so much for making the time tonight. And thank you for always being there whenever I have a question or have a concern on behalf of my constituents or on behalf of Canadians. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, Blaine, thank you for those very kind words. And Bob, to both of you, I'm very humbled to have your support and very much looking forward to working with you in a concerted fashion to help bring about some of the changes that we need in the country today. And, you know, Blaine, you said a mouthful. It's really about common sense. And it really is about getting it right for Canadians, and whether they're from big cities or small towns or the country. You know, we have to get away from this effort that we've seen to divide Canadians, to pit region against region, to do so for partisan gain, and really get back to focusing on the priorities of Canadians, fixing the economy, improving people's ability to get work, to do more for themselves, changing the laws in a way that makes sense, and stopping this offensive intrusion into Canadians' lives and loaded language that's meant to divide and cause division and derision in the country. I also want to thank Tracy and Tony for joining us tonight, and to everybody for taking part in this discussion. And we've touched on a broad range of topics, but the one takeaway that I want to ensure everybody has is that I stand with the lawful firearms community in this country. I will work with my colleagues, Bob and Blaine and others, to ensure that we're fighting real criminals in this country, and that we're doing our very best to protect Canadians in their homes, in their places of business, and their places of worship, and doing all of the things that government is expected to do. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue. It doesn't end here. It certainly doesn't end with this discussion. I want to wish everyone continued best health in these difficult and challenging times for you and your family. Stay healthy and stay strong and aim high. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. And for all of you that are out there, if you're a member of the Conservative Party, you're likely going to get a ballot in the mail at the beginning of July, and you have to vote and mail that back by August 21st. And not only are you voting for the next leader of the Conservative Party, but you're actually voting for what I know will be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And I sure hope that you will give every consideration to my friend, to Bob's friend, and a friend to a great number of MPs, current and past, and senators, who are all standing shoulder to shoulder with Peter MacKay. Thank you, Peter, for joining us tonight. And thank you, everybody, for getting onto the call. I hope this was helpful for you. Have a good night. God bless you all.